have taken rather a long view. That's to say, I'm really intending to talk about the next quarter of a century rather than the next year. Let me see. Start by saying a little bit about the changing shape of the world economy. I remain somewhat optimistic that growth in the Western economies will return. It's taken a while, and I didn't expect them to recover very quickly. The reason that I'm now beginning to be optimistic is that in both America and the United Kingdom, there are clear signs of increasing employment and growth that, if not great, is not bad. And I would include Japan here, although of course there are always questions about whether Japan really can get out of its, I would call it muscle-bound state. Where is the growth going to be? It seemed to me that in the context of the issues you're interested in today, that it was worth looking at an aspect of growth that doesn't get very much attention. On one side, you get a great deal of attention to the fact that the population of the world is growing older, and that people are now spending a much longer part of their lives in retirement. And if we look ahead, I will make a lot of this, that more and more people are going to be spending longer and longer in retirement, quite probably. And older people have somewhat different needs and lives from younger people. They may not be quite as healthy as younger people. A very large part of medical expenditures, health expenditures, are for dealing with older people. I'm happy to say that I still feel quite healthy, but I would actually count as one of these older people. And there is a little mystery here because I haven't given up working. But apparently a lot of people of my age would not wish to be working. I want to suggest you think about what this implies for demand, for what people are going to be buying, because that's quite important from the point of view of what investments are going to be needed and what investments are going to give a good return. Of course, it's well recognized that quite a lot of investment in the coming years is going to be in reductions in energy use and in the renewables, which were for a time becoming more and more important, although there is a reduction currently, demonstrated particularly by the great difficulties of the Chinese solar power industry. And of course there are reasons why nuclear power has perhaps diminished for a time as well. And of course information technology, the very fact of continuing changing technologies will mean that we keep pushing investment into newer areas. And of course development of service skills one way and another. That's to say, it's going to be more and more important to look at innovations in the service industries, because the service industries are a very large part of particularly the richer economies, but actually the emerging economies as well. What I have in mind there is the enormous growth of the educational sector, which is particularly notable in the emerging economies, and necessarily means a demand for all kinds of interesting new innovations in the delivery, which you can see with things like well, I had an email the other day saying that my one of my grandsons was learning how to program his computer by following courses from MIT. He lives in Sydney, Australia. This is a standard thing people are well aware of. But you see how this means that the service industries have a rather specific kind of demand for innovations in IT, which is probably a major direction that things are moving. But I want to draw attention particularly to the development of demand because of the growth of what I'm calling the senior population, older people, the over 60s, I suppose. And their demands are different. This is happening because of longer life and better health. Older people don't spend quite so much on food. I need to be specific here. They don't spend so much on foodstuffs. So this is something that arises at all kinds of levels. People are usually surprised to learn that the input of calories per head in India has fallen, not risen, as the income of the country has more than doubled. Because, of course, people are no longer doing the kinds of jobs that require a great deal of strength and outdoor activity and use a lot of calories. The preparation of food is another matter, and that's harder to judge. But that's the growth of the service industry in doing all the kind of decorative or ornamental activities that are associated with eating. Probably older people spend less on clothes. Not sure about that. They certainly use heating in the home more. And actually this is likely to be a force towards growth in energy use, not the decline. More leisure activities, travel, the growth of cruise liners and things like that. You would expect that to continue in a big way. More health care and residential care. And that's something I'm going to be developing a little more in the course of the lecture. And I actually think this is potentially really big, particularly because new technologies are continually coming into that field. Of course, all of this depends on the income that retired people will have, the benefits that they will be receiving. And one of the things that has been happening, was referred to in the previous talk, was that there are indeed some reductions in benefits, but I think that's relatively short term. That does depend very much on how government policies develop. And I may be looking the wrong way if I think that reductions in, I wouldn't call them taxes, in payment for late life services essentially through the tax system is really not going to decline after all, and that we'll go back to the enormous growth in welfare benefits and pensions that we've seen over the last 50 years. What about Italy? How does this fit into the picture? Well, I was interested, of course. I jumped onto the web, find out what the statistics say, and I'm sure I'm talking to an audience who knows this kind of stuff, but I just want to talk about its significance. Births 8.9 per thousand, deaths 10 per thousand. So, of course, it looks as though this is a country that should have a declining population, but it doesn't, because immigration is actually quite high at 4.5 per thousand, which is approximately half the rate of births. That's something that I'm quite familiar with. As you may have noticed from the first slide, I live in Hong Kong these days, and Hong Kong is a country where immigration is as high as births. So a country that you would expect, because of its low birth rate, to be moving towards a declining population is not, and has a continually increasing one, and likely to continue increasing for years and years to come. Whether that's true for Italy, of course, depends on current political developments and whether it is really possible to cut back on immigration. I assume particularly from Africa. I think that's very difficult. Life expectancy 82 years, not bad. And what does that mean in terms of years of retirement? I'm sure I'm exaggerating when I say that probably means 20 years of retirement on average. But I'm influenced there not by seeing figures for Italy, the age at which people stop working, which I dare say may often be unreliable figures. But I'm influenced by the British figures, where the average age at which males in Britain stop working is quite low. I don't know precisely what it is, but it's essentially 60 or less than that. A remarkably high proportion of the over 55s are no longer working. We're talking there, of course, of disability in some degree, and disability can become quite high. I was interested to see that for Italy, disability pensions are in value rather lower than state pensions as such, which is, of course, largely because people move on to the general state pension when they reach the normal retirement age. Anyway, for Italy, health expenditure is already nearly 10% of the GDP, and has been rising pretty rapidly. I am sure that's health expenditure, not only health expenditure from the public budget, but presumably includes private health expenditure. State pensions, however, this is definitely just public pensions, including the disability pension. 18% has doubled in 20 years. That naturally raises the question. I said I had a long time horizon in what I'm speaking about. Raises the question, will it double again in the next 20 years? If it did, that would be 36% of the GDP being on pensions. Is it possible? Well, life expectancy has been rising by a weekend every week. That's to say that essentially of about an increase every year of about approaching 100 days in the lifetime of people a year younger. Very remarkable that it's true all over the world. I'll come back to that issue. Health expenditures no doubt increase as well. So 36% plus more than 10% is approaching half of the GDP. Sorry, still haven't got properly programmed how to do this. Is it in fact impossible to have social security and health using half the national income? After what we just heard in the previous speech, where the push is towards reducing how much would be done through taxes, I'm sure this sounds quite impossible, particularly for a country where most of health expenditure and the pensions comes through the state and through compulsory saving and insurance rather than through taxation exactly, but they may be called social security taxes. Well, it's not totally absurd to think that that's something people might actually choose to have and might want if they were carefully rational about what it is they want out of things. There have been observations that as countries have got richer, insofar as people have had a choice about when they would retire, people, we've got this increasing life expectancy. The remarkable feature is that people have some tendency in the richer countries to retire earlier, not later. To me, that's I find it extremely hard to understand. If I expect to live for another 20 years, I don't wish to sit in front of the television and or lie in bed late in the morning for 20 years. But anyway, this is what is reflected in the observations of what people choose to do. And it's not obviously irrational if people decide that they would like to spend a large proportion of their lifetime income on being retired and having time to do what they want. If you think of these as people doing unpleasant jobs, the world is divided into those who have nice jobs like mine and people who have nasty jobs that and I don't just mean having to get out on the farm at 5 in the morning or go to milk the cattle, but it's pretty tough being a school teacher, and most school teachers don't want to go on beyond 60. And equally, it seems entirely reasonable. People are wondering, what shall I spend money on? Shall I spend money on a very expensive watch, or buying a really nice, very expensive new dress? Or shall I spend money on being healthier, on living longer in comfort? Well, on the face of it, this is quite an easy choice to make, and it is a choice that many people have made. So I think it would be a mistake to think that somehow it's impossible for expenditures on state pensions and health to continue rising as a proportion of the GDP. And I will not be surprised if around the time when I'm being put away in a retirement home or something like that, that we'll be beginning to approach at least the 40% level, maybe 45. And I draw your attention again to what all of that implies for the pattern of demand in the world, and what kinds of industries. Means that tremendous scope for investing in things like hospitals and retirement homes and insurance. All of this, of course, would seem less burdensome or absurd if one could consider the kind of rate of return on investments that I was hearing about last night, 9% a year, rather than the negative rate of return, real rate of return on investment that is implied by almost zero rates of interest on government securities in government borrowing in America or Europe. Well, what about the developed? That's the developed economies. Many governments have been changing the private-public proportion for health and pensions, of course, moving towards the private direction. And that may well involve a change in the effective transfers between generations. If you have a pay-as-you-go pension system, that means that, of course, that people are relying on their children or the children of other people to provide for them in retirement. If you change over towards private pension schemes or something, or funded pension schemes, then people are having to provide for themselves by investing and using the returns from it. I just want to emphasize that it's not perfectly obvious which of these should be done. Roughly speaking, you would expect that in a very fast-growing economy like China, that it makes much more sense for the future generations to be paying the pensions of the current generation. In other words, to pay as you go, because the future generation is so much better off. It's only reasonable to redistribute from the future to the present generations. Not so clear in somewhere like Italy, where things are fairly steady. Problem with health is achieving really satisfactory insurance. The issue is that on pensions, you might reasonably think, oh well, if you get a good return, you should get a better pension. Most people would choose a degree of risk trade-off between the uncertainty of exactly what pension you'll get and a higher average expectation. That doesn't make much sense on the health side, where you pretty much think that what you'll need, you'll need. It's true that there is scope for more luxurious treatment, better bed in hospital, room to yourself perhaps, better food, which are health-associated expenditures that are often bundled together with arrangements for health. But the difficulty is to cover people who early in life get some chronic illness and who will not early in life have made appropriate health insurance arrangements. And also there's a lot of evidence from America, of course, that an immense number of people simply don't make provision for the health of their future selves. And that's exactly why Obamacare was introduced. It seems to make sense to have compulsion one way or another. Europe has accepted this as a perfectly reasonable way of arranging things. America finds it harder to make that particular transition. What about the return to capital that you can get? I said everything would make much more sense if you could get a good positive rate of return to capital, because then what it would cost to do the investments that would give a return that could be used to pay for future pensions and healthcare is not so much. That's what a high return means. It means that it's cheaper to provide for things in the future. Of course, we've run through a period when things went very bad indeed. Financial assets sustained large losses. The stock markets collapsed in some degree. Then the interest rates have become very low, dividends low, and I know there are a lot of insurance schemes, defined benefit schemes, which look as though they're going to be in very great difficulties. Interest rates are likely to be kept low for at least another year. The Fed has said perfectly clearly that there's going to be no reason to taper off the quantitative easing arrangements holding down long-term rates of interest until unemployment has fallen a bit more yet. And I think that's quite reasonable given the tight constraint they operate under, with fiscal policy not being really an available tool. But I must say, I think it has been a rather terrible choice that has been made in the West, essentially to have a rather tight fiscal policy pushing towards eliminating the deficits, and have an attempt to do something by very low interest rates, which is not surprisingly almost entirely ineffective. And it would have been much better for everybody if much higher rates of interest had been maintained. But there we are. That's the situation we have, and making a largely political rather than economic guess, I don't see any immediate prospect for a rise in these interest rates. The one thing that may make quite a difference is a fall in commodity prices. Because of fracking, we seem likely to move into a period when the price of oil may fall. We may move back into a low oil price period. Now, for I think quite understandable reasons, the world has for a long time been in a situation that when the oil price goes up, you get a recession. And when the oil price comes back down again, you can get back into something more like a boom. If tomorrow we find oil prices halve, then that might well be a signal that it's all going to come right a little bit sooner. But things are always uncertain in the economic world, so I can't promise that. But there are reasons to hope, at least within a period of 2 years. But profits are high in the world. That's in many ways a very striking feature of the current world. Profits have been, as a proportion of GDP, have been going up. Who's getting these profits? I mean, what that means is that the rate of return to capital is there. And so in fact, I wasn't very surprised to hear last night that there are investment funds that manage over a period of years to get quite high returns. So that's the direction to be looking at, finding out how you can get a share of these immense profits which are created in the world. So the actual rate of return available is pretty high. It's just that people like me can't seem to get at it. It makes sense to have higher pensions when the return to capital has been high. Some risk is acceptable, I remarked on that already, in return for a higher expected pension. But I think that's the direction that you'd expect things to go. The same does not apply to healthcare. People should pay something in advance for their late life healthcare, but the government should provide compensatory payments when the health fund proves insufficient. I don't know in detail how that could be managed, but that seems to be the right philosophy for handling it. Time I moved on to tell you something about China. A lot of the same issues arise in China. Of course, income per head is much lower than in Italy, for example. Specifically, Italy's is about 4 times as high as China's in real terms. Life expectancy in China is 76, which of course is 6 years less than in Italy. But it's over 80 in Beijing, despite the high levels of pollution. So there's a big difference, urban-rural, in China, which makes quite a lot of difference to what you expect to happen. Urban retirement is supposed to average less than 60. So China has already got into a situation that, at least seen through the statistics, retirement seems to be quite a long period. So they do have already some of the same features that we've seen here. Although certainly anecdotally, I believe there's a lot of part-time retirement that is not picked up in the figures. Rural pensions are pretty tiny, actually, and quite recent. Health expenditure, 5.2% of GDP. That's both private and public spending on health. So about half of what it is. Well, you wouldn't be surprised. You'd expect poorer countries are bound to. But of course, remember that we're saying income's a quarter of the Italian. So this is saying that they're spending 1/8 of what an Italian would spend on health care. And that might make you wonder what the consequences would be. But nobody believes that this is to be seen as the reason why life expectancy is 6 years less in China. And only 6 years less, and really the impact of this smaller expenditure is much less. It's something to reflect on. The pension system, well, actually, even what the legislation, if you can call it legislation, says, is pretty poor coverage. An awful lot of people miss. Self-employed are not, who are very numerous, are not really included, and there's very little in rural areas. A substantial part of the pension is from individual accounts, built up while in employment, with compulsory payments to be made by the employer and the employee. And then they get paid out over 10 years, which of course makes not a lot of sense for somebody who's going to be retired for 20. Many employers do not make the contributions that they should. Public authorities make a practice of raiding these individual accounts. Simply take the money out of them and use it for other more immediate necessities. So what will happen when people try to get at their empty accounts, we shall watch and see. And migrant workers, who are the people who come from rural areas to urban areas and do not have official registration, are not allowed to go to schools, and the children can't go to schools in the urban area. They are supposed not to be able to make use of health facilities. They're poorly covered in the pension arrangements as well. In maybe 10 years' time, population in China is going to start falling. the number of retired will increase. People make calculations that show that they will become more numerous than workers. I'm sure that's exaggerated. It assumes there'll be no change in the retirement age, and of course that's changing already and it's bound to be changed. It's supposed to be very worrying, but because the retirement age will increase, I wonder if it really is such a problem. There will be no great problem if the coverage remains poor. The real problem is that that can't continue. So that's bound to raise all the sorts of issues that are troubling people in Italy now, the amount of money it takes to provide pensions. Of course, currently, savings is what's doing it. Saving is high, even personal saving. I think it should be clear the total saving in China was for a period of 5 years averaging over half the GDP. But out of that, quite a lot is actually done by businesses, enterprises, and quite a lot is done by the government. However, it's also true that most households save quite a lot, except the poorer end. And of course, the old and young help one another. What I have in mind is that people save up a lot in order to be able to send their children to universities in America or wherever. So that's the old helping the young. And then the young certainly, once they get a bit older, will be prepared to pay quite a lot to look after their parents in old age. And that is quite a reasonable way of providing. The trouble is it's not a very equitable way of providing for people, because some do not have the children, or their children are pretty poor. What about the prospects for health? Well, insurance is a particularly difficult problem for developing economies because of the transaction costs and policies. And selection problems are hard. The people who choose to go after the insurance are the ones who need it too much. So it seems particularly convincing there that public health service is what's wanted. And there it's just difficult to have good coverage across the country, to get people, good doctors, to go where the people most in need of health care are. Free trade in services could achieve so much there. I mean, health provision from other countries that have gained a lot of expertise. Well, certainly a country like Britain gains immensely from being able to have doctors immigrate temporarily or permanently from all over the world. We really, in Britain, rely very much on that. But I wanted to finish by talking about Hong Kong. Because against the contrast of Italy and China, this is going to tell you, if you know about it, you know, but if you don't know, it's going to tell you a rather surprising story. 50 years ago, of course, Hong Kong was a poor country. That's when I first visited and saw the extremes of Asian poverty in the back streets where most people were. It went through what I'll call a Chinese explosion, East Asian economic explosion, 10 to 15 years before China, and had growth rates in some years over 10%. Same kind of phenomenon. Public and private spending, it spends the same proportion of GDP on health as mainland China. Not the same as Italy, the same as mainland China. Current income per head in Hong Kong is higher than in Italy. Pensions and other welfare benefits are low. Pensions are funded. That's to say, people pay into a provident fund, which becomes available to them at 65. It's too small, but people do a lot of investment. Half the adults or half the people of Hong Kong own actual stocks and shares. So there's a lot of interest in doing it yourself. Life expectancy is one of the highest in the world. It's somewhat higher than Italy's. So apparently it's possible to be very healthy on 5% of GDP. America finds it hard to be adequately healthy on over 15% of GDP, although it's much richer. This is a question I like to ask students when they come to be admitted to my college in Hong Kong. And they give me very varied answers, if they can think of any answer at all, as to how Hong Kong manages to be apparently very healthy, although spending so much less on medical care than most European countries, and so much less than America. Although perhaps the most interesting and plausible answer I got from one of my colleagues in Chinese university there, who said, oh, well, it's just that people don't think that they should spend very large amounts on looking after themselves or their parents at the end of life. And indeed, I know of many people who simply decide that they don't want to have expensive chemotherapy, which will be very unpleasant. And they perfectly see that they may die a little sooner, but that they may find it more comfortable. They simply don't value this idea of getting an extra month at whatever cost. So it's conceivable we have here a cultural difference which could not easily be moved to another country. But I still can't help wondering if Hong Kong could be an alternative future for countries like Italy that are in search for a different possibility. So in the cause of saying there are alternatives, I draw your attention to this. Of course, health expenditures in Hong Kong may rise because seniors are expected to be a larger proportion of the population. But this is a world point. Life may not continue to lengthen. I've looked at a rather simple graph showing life expectancy in different countries, all put onto the same graph. I'm not going to bother you with it here. And the top life expectancy tends to be Japan, Hong Kong, so on. If you follow that track, of course it has continued to increase. And I described earlier the extra weekend every week, but it's getting slower. It has been getting slower in a fairly steady way for quite a long time. If you make an intelligent projection, then life expectancy is going to stop increasing shortly after it reaches 85. That would very much change the long-term prospects. good public health might keep costs down. That's something that may well explain why it's worked in Hong Kong. Pensions being funded, well, it is a help. And the problem is the level. I admire the Italian system of high pensions more than the Hong Kong system of low ones. Immigration contributes to the working population. Is that something the European countries are prepared to accept as a way of helping? But it may be one model, at least for China, if not for Italy. So there are alternatives. Thank you very much.